our last lesson, we looked at how Berg uses the series in his violin concerto. But as we've seen, there are substantial parts of the piece that don't refer to the series. How can we understand Berg's harmonic choices in those parts? And even in the parts of the piece that do refer to the series, why one choice as opposed to another? Before we go into detail, an important concept: degree of dissonance. If you compare the four dissonances in this example, the fourth sounds definitely less dissonant than the minor second. The same distinction applies to chords. Although it's not an exact science, I think we can agree that the second chord here is more dissonant than the first one. The two minor seconds create a kind of tension we don't hear in the dominant seventh chord. The reason it's hard to make absolute comparisons between chords is that register and timbre also affect our perception. For example, which of these two chords sounds more dissonant? You may have noticed that they're actually the same chord but spaced differently. Usually, the farther apart the dissonant notes are from one another, the gentler they sound. Similarly, dissonances in the same timbre are stronger than in different timbres. As a general rule, chords including semitone relationships tend to be the most harmonically intense. In fact, in a context with lots of chords with semitones, a fourth can sound quite consonant. Now let's compare two harmonies in the Berg Violin Concerto. Here's the end of the first movement. As you can see, this is G minor 7th chord. Here's the chord at the start of the second movement. This chord has 8 different pitches and multiple semitone clashes. It's very intense. When these chords occur is significant. The first movement ends with that simple 7th chord. In the language of this piece, this is milder than many of the harmonies heard up to now. This chord also lasts for a long time. The harmonic rhythm is slowed down a lot. As in traditional tonal music, slower harmonic rhythm creates a sense of relative calm. The chord from the start of the second movement creates a lot of tension and suspense, which is appropriate for a dramatic beginning. Although it's also sustained, many other notes are quickly added to it, so the harmonic rhythm is not very stable. This chord at the end of the second movement is also a 7th chord, this time with no semitone relationships at all, so it's even gentler than the end of the first movement. And note the perfect fifth arpeggios at the end, reminding us of the opening of the concerto. The point of all this is that Berg uses various degrees of dissonance and harmonic rhythm to create tension and release. Let's look at some examples in more detail. The introduction to the first movement has a relatively simple texture, alternating clarinet and solo violin for the arpeggios in the main line. These arpeggios alternate between perfect fifth arpeggios and arpeggios based on the whole tone scale. The accompaniment is made of sustained notes in the clarinets, mostly in triadic harmony. It starts with just a pedal B flat in measure 1. In measure 2 it stays quite consonant with the solo violin, reaching the only semitone dissonance on the last eighth note of the bar, F sharp. and then F sharp resolves immediately to F natural, the start of the next bar. Measure 3 contains only notes from the whole tone scale. Measure 4 has two semitones on the last beat, F, F sharp, and B flat A. The sequence continues with some triadic harmony and some whole tone harmony up to the peak in measure 8. Then the main line comes down, ending with the G minor chord in the lower parts in measure 10. The violin solo does hold an E flat during the G minor chord, so there is some tension, and this is the most prominent dissonance so far in the piece. This E flat then resolves to D in measure 12, where the orchestra presents the tone row as a series of chords. Note also the way the bass line rises conjunctly until the B flat in measure 9, which then becomes the third of the G minor chord in the bass. This is a typical directed bass line, and it gives the harmony a sense of clear progression, quite apart from the dissonances. Overall, this introduction is rather calm compared to what will come later. One aspect of Berg's harmony that we haven't yet touched on allows for even more complex situations. He often uses a kind of layering in his harmonic textures. Here's an example from measure 28 to 37 in the first movement. The main line here is based on a three-note motive, first heard in the flute in measure 28. Measure 30, the solo violin enters with the same motive answering the flute, then in measure 32 to 33, the violin presents it in augmentation. This line has lots of major and minor seconds, an interval not found in this series. If this line were alone, it could conceivably be harmonized in a more or less tonal way, perhaps like this. My harmonization is fairly consonant, and it modulates several times, but the modulations are smoothed over with mostly conjunct voice leading. The harmonic rhythm is relatively fast, but that in itself would not have surprised, say, Wagner. But Berg's accompaniment to this main line is another matter altogether. In measure 28 to 29, the strings hold a diminished chord, which then chromatically moves to what would, in a tonal context, be seen as a 5-4-2 of A. This arrives in the second beat of measure 29 in the harp, while the bass is static over D. But this chord doesn't resolve as we would expect. Then, in measure 29 to 32, the bassoon and the pizzicato cellos present a part of the series inverted in steady eighth notes, as a counterpoint to the main line in the solo violin. As a bass to the solo violin, this is sometimes quite dissonant, for example measure 30, and at times more consonant, for example measure 31. But in measure 30, two clarinets enter with a syncopated motive, mostly in parallel major thirds. These thirds don't create strong dissonances with the violin or the bass line, except at the peak of the clarinet's line, the B flat against the B natural at the start of measure 32. This does set off the peak, which makes musical sense. Right after this, in measure 32-33, Berg adds muted horns, also using the syncopated motive. The horns and the clarinets alone make recognizable seventh chords for two beats, but then become more independent in measure 33. They also have numerous semitone dissonances with the bass line, which now presents a familiar zigzag motive in the double bass. Measure 34, at the peak of the violin line, also has several semitone dissonances. So this is the most intense, most dissonant part of the phrase. When the line comes down and reaches a point of rest in measure 36-37, the texture lightens and there is less semitone dissonance. The violin and its accompaniment are also now in the same register, so there are less distinct planes of tone. In other words, there's a sense of resolution here at what amounts to the cadence of the phrase. So we have multiple planes of tone here, each with its own distinctive timbre, motive, and harmonic world. Within each plane, the harmony has some consonances, but not consistently or for very long. The overall effect is certainly not in any clearly discernible key, but there is a sense that the harmony has waves of tension. For example, in measure 28-29, the harmony is relatively simple, but then as the other layers are added, it gets more intense. Now, if all this activity were in one single plane of tone, say the strings, it would just be incoherent. The timbral separation makes the whole into a kind of counterpoint of textures, layers, instead of a counterpoint of single lines. Similarly, when the chorale arrives in the second movement, it's presented first in Bach's original harmonization, and then gradually combined with more and more dissonant added layers, again creating various degrees of harmonic tension. Now, it's true that Bach's original version has some dissonances, but they're handled in the traditional way, enriching a fundamentally triadic structure and resolving immediately and by step. However, Berg's dissonances do not always resolve in a classical way, but his sensitivity to gradations of dissonance has an enormous effect on the harmonic structure of the concerto, allowing it to breathe, unlike some less successful serial pieces, which remain suffocatingly dissonant all the time. Here's another passage from the first movement that illustrates this. A new theme is presented in measure 104. If you just look at the bass here, it looks like D major moving down stepwise to D flat major. But if you look at the upper parts, they seem to start in D flat major. When they arrive at D major, start at measure 105, the bass line has already begun to leave that key, and when the bass then moves to D flat major, the upper part, now the solo violin, seems to arrive in C. So it is as though they each modulate between two keys, but not at the same time. But when the third member of this sequence arrives in measure 108-109, the tonal relationship between the main line in the oboes and the bass in the cellos is less dissonant. So again, there's a kind of harmonic breathing here, alternating between more and less dissonant relationships while using the same motivic material. Again, this is how Berg lets the music breathe. To sum up, voice leading, the contrast between clearly directed conjugate movement and punctuating leaps in the bass, various degrees of dissonance in the harmony, variety of harmonic rhythm, and the cadential release of tension, these are all familiar from classical tonal harmony. What's distinctive in Berg's harmonic style is his use of richer structures, built with thirds and whole tone passages, various passages in linear harmony, and the textural layering referred to above.